Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Higgins Climate Change and Health Forum, hosted by the Australian Medical Association of Victoria and Doctors for the Environment of Australia, or DEA. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. So I'd like to acknowledge the Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples as the traditional owners and custodians of the lands where our wonderful communities within Higgins lie today. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and to emerging leaders. So my name's Dr. Catherine Pendry. I'm a general practitioner, medical educator, and sometimes researcher. So notwithstanding my passion for rural health, I've grown up and spent most of my life in Higgins. I played for Ashburton Soccer Club, trained at East Melbourne Tennis Club, and attended school in the area. Almost 15 years ago, when I was in medical school, I read an article published in one of the world's leading medical journals, The Lancet, that declared that climate change is the biggest threat to global health of the 21st century. In the time that's passed, we've learned a lot about climate change and the many ways it impacts our health. Every time the evidence has been updated, the message has been exactly the same, that climate change is happening sooner, faster, and more severely than we thought. And now climate change is something that we have all experienced. We all remember the horrors of Black Saturday that changed our very understanding of what bushfires are in this country and claimed the lives of 173 people. Less well known is that the week before, more than twice as many people died as a result of an unprecedented heat wave, and hospitals and ambulances were almost overwhelmed by the number of people needing emergency care because of the heat. And just before COVID-19, we had Black Summer, when bushfire smoke caused more than 400 deaths, 2,000 hospitalizations for lung problems, and 1,000 hospitalizations for cardiovascular problems. If we don't want a world where our children, or in my case, nephews and niece, have to deal with health risks like this every year, we need our political leaders to take much stronger action to reduce emissions this decade, before 2030. Now, in September this year, leading medical journals again issued a call to action. But this time, it wasn't just one. More than 200 of the world's leading medical journals, including the Medical Journal of Australia, declared that the greatest threat to global public health is the continued failure of world leaders to keep global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees and to restore nature. Now, the world's already warmed by 1.2 degrees, and Harvard University research estimates that fossil fuels are now responsible for 1 in 5 deaths globally. The policy commitments we've seen in Australia so far just aren't enough, not nearly. There's an urgent need for much stronger action to implement science-based policies to drive the transition to a healthier future powered by renewables. Yet, unfortunately, we still hear that responding to the climate crisis would be too difficult, too fast, or too risky. Well, we know that isn't going to be good enough, not by a long shot. If we do not reduce global emissions by at least 50% by 2030, it won't just be risky, it's going to be downright dangerous. And to reach this global target, Australia is going to need to do far more than it's doing now. Economists, engineers, business leaders, climate scientists, and health professionals are all saying that it's not only possible, but necessary. So now's the time for us to do what's right, for the next generation, for our health, and for our planet. Tonight, we have the privilege to hear from health leaders. First, we'll be hearing from Professor Peter Brooks, AM, a rheumatologist, medical researcher, and member of DEA, followed by Dr. Roderick McRae, an anaesthetist, intensive care physician, and president of AMA Victoria. And we'll then hear from our local political candidates. Dr. Michelle Ananda-Raja, ALP candidate, who's an infectious diseases specialist and general physician at a major Melbourne hospital and has a distinguished career as a medical researcher. Dr. Katie Allen, the LNP candidate, and of course, the current sitting member, who was elected in 2019, prior to which she also had a distinguished career as a pediatrician and medical researcher. And Sonia Semmons, the Greens candidate, who's an NGO consultant and an educator, who's worked for over 2 decades in the not-for-profit sector. So after we hear from all of our speakers, we're going to move into a Q&A session, where you'll all have the chance to ask questions to our speakers via the chat Q&A box. I do ask that our questions are kept respectful tonight. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to our first speaker, Professor Peter Brooks. Over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Catherine. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet tonight and recognise their elders past, present and emerging. As doctors, we see the impact of global warming on our patients every day. So what are some of these impacts? Increasing air pollution is already causing over 2% of all deaths in Australia and reducing life expectancy of our children. We're acutely aware in Melbourne of thunderstorm asthma and the bushfires causing increased air pollution. Fire seasons in Australia are getting longer and more severe and costly, particularly for humans suffering. In other parts of the world, forest fires have devastated vast areas over the last year, even threatening major cities such as Athens. We've also seen heat waves this year killing many hundreds of people in North America and Europe. Yet overall, the impact of temperature on health is showing a much greater increase in Australia than many other countries. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are most severely affected. This is in part because they live in areas of the country which are hotter at baseline, and these communities already suffer social disadvantage, particularly of low standard housing and overcrowding, which can exacerbate heat stress. Of course, we must remember that other groups disproportionately impacted by heat are those of us over the age of 65 with pre-existing medical conditions and our young children. We also know that strokes, heart attacks and kidney injury can be precipitated by heat and associated dehydration. Let's think about the impact of heat on sporting events. Every year recently, we've seen matches in the Australian Open cancelled because of heat affecting spectators and players. Scientists predict Sydney and Melbourne will have increasing days when temperatures will be in excess of 50 degrees centigrade. Just imagine how we'll cope with that, not only from the effects on the health and welfare of us all, but the impact on the economy with loss of worker productivity, particularly if working outdoors. Then add the impact of other severe weather events, destructive winds and floods, which we've recently experienced and are experiencing at this moment around Australia, causing damage to persons and property and to the environment. All of these events only speed destruction of our fragile biodiversity. Again, Australia is unfortunately a gold medal winner in that at least 100 species of flora and fauna have become extinct since white settlement, more than in any other country. So COP23 has been and gone, and it's clear from the science that the 2030 commitments for carbon emission reductions made by countries will not maintain global warming at lower than 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees. This will cause lasting damage to us and the planet and is just not acceptable. We can and must do better. Australia is the dunce in the room, voted by the world as the worst performing student on planet Earth on our performance to date. The colossal fossil, not a thing we should be proud of. Our governments continue to financially support and actively promote coal and gas extraction when all the science tells us for our children and our grandchildren to survive and thrive, carbon fuels must stay in the ground. In the next 6 months, we will face probably the most important election ever held in Australia, because the government we elect will play a key role in decisions and actions taken by the global community over the next few years. These decisions will significantly impact on the future of civilization as we know it. We need a government that can show leadership on the global stage, do the right thing by the global community, including our Pacific neighbours, as well as taking the actions required to protect all Australians now and into the future. The really important message for all of you tonight is we can change. We can keep to 1.5 degree warming using all the technologies we have available in Australia now, sun, wind, and other renewables. We cannot risk our future on solutions we don't have. This surely is our opportunity to step up when needed. It will be a challenge, but we can do it. But we need to do it now. Not in 2025, not in 2030, nor even 2050. We need to act now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Peter Brooks. All right, we'll now hand over to Dr. Roderick McRae, President of AMA Victoria. Thanks very much.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Catherine, for your introduction. In the spirit of reconciliation, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, their connections to land, sea and community. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples present today. I'd like to thank Doctors for the Environment for taking the initiative in organising tonight's event, or this forum. I think it is very important. I'm a local constituent of Higgins myself, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what our panel members have to say. Now, the AMA, and certainly AMA Victoria, is the peak medical professional organisation in Victoria. And while we've sort of broadly been swamped by everything to do with COVID-19, we actually have many interests, and the environment is one of them. There are profound challenges, and you've just heard from the previous two introductory sentences and paragraphs about many of those things. Very broadly, there are plenty of challenges in and around healthcare, and this isn't entirely about healthcare, of course, but coming from the profession, we need to acknowledge that that is the case. It's actually a very fundamental, important healthcare background issue. So around about 7% of the total Australian emissions, we just heard about the large score, but about 7% comes from healthcare. It's particularly our hospitals, but it's also how we make pills, the pharmaceuticals, build the buildings that are the hospitals, all the infrastructure, and public and private medicine. So it's complex. The healthcare facilities themselves all currently have chimneys, and that contributes to everything that you've just heard discussed by the previous two introductory speakers. So this ambient air pollution, it broadly has a negative health impact. This is not good. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare suggests that there's about 0.6% of disease burden. Doesn't sound too much, but it's real, and it's there all of the time. It comes in the air that we breathe and take in with every breath. So you've heard some of the diseases to which it contributes, and it's right up there with sun exposure, and indeed it contributes to just over 1% of fatalities. So we believe that the climate is an existential challenge, and how we're going to deal with it is fundamentally important. AMA Victoria has advocated at length over many, many years, looking to undertake measures to reduce carbon emissions, curtail waste. You'd be frightened about the waste we generate as we look after you, and managing all of our resources efficiently. And so that will ultimately lead to an underlying long-term improvement in the benefit of healthcare of all of our citizens. We work very hard within Victoria to get the new and desperately required Footscray Hospital to be all electric, renewable energy, but apparently the sums could only work if it's 50% gas. So that'll be 50% gas for however long that hospital is going to be running on that. I acknowledge it's a state issue, but we need to look for greater national coordination on all these sorts of points. I'm very pleased that while we're negotiating enterprise agreements for public hospitals, the Victorian government's undertaken that there will be clauses in looking at how the employers are aligning particular requirements from the health services, statements on their formal positions related to climate change and provision of an annual update. This is something brand new, and it's going to come into all enterprise agreements across all industries, and we're pleased to be the first. I recognise that medical practitioners are influential in the public debate, and that's why we get in there and work through, and we understand we need to decarbonise our own sector. We've been hearing in the news about 2030. We've been hearing about what I'll call noting the mediocre political speak out of COP26 summit. And while I also acknowledge it's the first time that it's expressly committed to reducing the use of coal, a buzzword is phasing out. it is going to be challenging for Australia, but we believe we can find the way to be sophisticated and intelligent and clever to work our way around all of these sorts of issues. AMA policy is to achieve net zero carbon by 2040. We've had discussions about 2030. I think it's very important to understand that we've been jumping up and down with joy that in 2032, 2 years later, the Olympic Games are going to be in Brisbane. We're very familiar with the COVID-19 curves and exponential growth of change, particularly when things amplify and get out of control. If we don't do something by 2030 and recognise the Victorian government has its own ambition of carbon neutrality by 2025, we don't know what the Olympic Games in Brisbane will look like. Will it be 55 degrees in the shade? Will it be monsoonal rain? Will it be both? Will we have arthropod-borne viruses? Note today, India has dengue going out of control. Will that be what we invite people to as they come to Brisbane to enjoy that sport? So we need to take everything very, very seriously. We certainly call for a national approach to get Australia coordinated and everything aligned going through. So while I've mentioned a couple of state issues, it's very much a national approach and of course that integrates with an international approach. I'm very eager to learn of the changes that businesses will be invited or incentivised to make. So I very much look forward to hearing our panel members discuss this intensely important issue. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Roderick. It's fantastic to hear about the leadership of the AMA on taking action on climate change as a health issue, and the fantastic leadership in greening the healthcare sector. As you highlighted, it's one important example of the transition we need to make, but that we do need that reinforcement from strong national coordination and national policies. All right, we'll now move on to hear our opening remarks from our political candidates before we move into the Q&A session. So we've asked each of our political candidates to speak for 4 minutes in response to the following. Given that we need urgent action to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees to protect health from climate change, what actions will your party take to reduce greenhouse gas emissions before 2030? So to keep things fair and even, I will be timing our opening remarks, and I will ask each of our candidates to close off their comments after 4 minutes, just so that we have, so that everything's even and we have time to move into the Q&A session. So first off, we're very grateful to hear from Dr. Michelle Ananda-Rajah. All right, over to you, Michelle, thank you.
Thanks, Catherine, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. I also wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we live and work and pay my respects to elders, past and present, and to emerging leaders. Look, it's a real honor tonight to address you all. What I will say, though, ladies and gentlemen, is that the nation is desperate, absolutely desperate for real action on climate change. We are approaching a decade now with the coalition government and still have no credible climate policy, no prospect of obtaining a credible climate policy. And we are now out of time. We are facing, as all the other speakers have said, the decisive decade. The next 10 years is a window of opportunity to get this right before we start triggering cataclysmic changes in the planet, which I really don't even want to talk about because it is absolutely dire and incompatible with life as we know it. We have just seen, the unedifying spectacle of this government, chaotic government in the lead up to COP26, scrambling 1 minute to midnight to craft a climate policy when they have actually been in government for 8 years. We have also seen the Prime Minister at Glasgow confirm to not only us, but to the rest of the world that Australia is a laggard, that Australia is a global pariah, and that Australia is a handbrake on progress to decarbonize this world. We in the Labor Party are appalled by what we have seen, and we stand ready to step into this leadership void and navigate this nation through this turbulence, understanding that we only have 10 years to get this right, okay? but we are ready to decarbonize this country. We are ready to turn Australia into a renewable energy superpower and take advantage of the enormous economic, social, and environmental benefits and opportunities that are there for the taking. They are ours for the taking. So how are we going to do this? I don't have very long to talk to you for, so I'm just going to give you a cook's tour, basically. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to legislate a 2050 target, all right? This will be an act of parliament, and it will signal to the world that Australia is committed to decarbonising and driving us to net zero by 2050. It is not an empty promise from a prime minister who takes liberties with the truth, okay? We are signalling to the world that we are good faith actors. And what this will do is that it will unlock the vast quantities of climate finance that are waiting at our doorstep. The constraint in Australia is not capital. The constraint is certainty. Investors have stayed away from Australia because there is a confused mess with regards to our climate policy. And the climate finance that I'm talking about is somewhere in the order of 130 trillion US. That's 12 zeros, okay, which has come off the back of Glasgow. That money is there for the taking. We want to open the door. We want to roll out the red carpet and get the band playing and get some of that money coming down to Australia. The second thing we want to do is, due to the sheer volume of private and public money that will be circulating, we need to put some safeguards in place. So we will be also legislating a federal anti-corruption commission. This is incredibly important in order to wrap probity around the policies and the money and the projects that will be delivered after many, many years of institutionalized misconduct in the Morrison-Joyce government. We are ready to clean up this mess. The other things we will do are more prosaic. We're going to be rewiring the nation, basically with $20 billion to modernize the grid. The Biden administration is doing exactly the same. We're going to be installing community batteries at a cost of $200 million. This is for apartment dwellers and people who can't afford to install batteries. We're also going to be making EVs cheaper, okay? So by removing inefficient taxes.
Thanks very much, Michelle. Unfortunately, that's the 4 minutes. I appreciate it's an incredible amount to cover in a short period of time. Hopefully we'll be able to address other aspects in Q&A. All right, we'll now move over to Sonia Semmons to give her opening 4 minutes in response to the same question. Thanks very much, Sonia.
Thanks, Dr. Catherine. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm on, the Bunurong people, and I pay respect to elders past and present and any First Nations people here tonight. We all agree that the climate emergency is the most significant global threat to human health facing humanity. We all agree that it's already having consequences and that these will get worse. I've been telling stories for decades with development agencies about the Bay of Bengal, the Nigerian Delta, Queensland, Tobago. The first climate change victims have been lost. We all agree time is of the essence and we all know the science. And it's this: every serious assessment of what's needed to stop catastrophic climate change says we need to do just one thing: stop the extraction and burning of coal, oil, and gas urgently. Yet this is the one thing that neither Labor nor the Liberals will do. Instead, as we'll hear in two fine speeches tonight, they propose a Trojan horse for more fossil fuel, carbon capture, imaginary technology that doesn't exist, and a gas-led recovery. In this room, it leaves me with one question. If climate change were a disease, is this how you'd treat it? We've seen what government can do when real disease threatens people. We take action. We turn our lives and our communities upside down to protect those we love. Climate change asks the same of us, but best of all, we have the technologies we need already. We don't need to turn lives upside down. Our future is powered by sunshine, wind, and water, and Australia has plenty to spare. The Greens' plan to keep 1.5 alive is to follow the science. We aim for 75% emission reduction by 2030, just like the Independent Climate Targets panel led by former Liberal leader John Hewson says we should. And here's how we do that. We immediately ban the construction of new coal, oil, and gas infrastructure. No new mines. Liberal and Labor have over 116 projects in the pipeline. They cannot go ahead. We stop the subsidies. The 21-22 budget contained over $51 billion in fossil fuel subsidies of public money. We get no return on this. except jobs for former politicians. Instead, we reinvest that money into a planned transition for our coal communities, workers who've spent the last 100 years keeping the lights on and who deserve a plan. Then we phase out the mining, burning and export of thermal coal by 2030, as the Glasgow Pact asks us to do, and we make polluters pay a carbon levy. We use those funds for massive investment in a clean energy generation and export, creating hundreds of thousands of new jobs, a renewables revolution in the sunniest country on earth. Instead of deadly, dirty coal, the only kind there is, we'll sell sunshine to our neighbours. That's how you treat a patient. And it'll help me treat another patient too. My daughter, who won't watch Attenborough, the one on Netflix with Greta in it, or any of them anymore. My daughter, who I told in the middle of those nightmare bushfires when our city was covered in smoke and you could look straight at the sun, and I told her, don't worry, the adults are onto it. I meant you. You're onto it. You, the doctors of Higgins. Fossil fuel is the disease. You must cure it. Thank you.
Wow.
All right, thanks very much, Sonia, and coming in under 4 minutes. All right, we'll now hand over to Dr. Katie Allen, again, for your 4-minute opening remarks in response to our question. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Catherine, and thank you to the Doctors for Environmental Action for your hosting of tonight. And welcome, Michelle and Sonia. It's great to have you online. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we all Zoom meet and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And just to say that it is absolutely right, everyone has said, that we have to have more action on climate. And from the very first day that I was elected as the member for Higgins, I have said we need strong action on climate. But more importantly than that, this is not just a moral crisis for this world. This is actually an economic opportunity. And I said in my first speech that this is not just an environmental imperative, it's actually an economic imperative. There is an opportunity for Australia to transition from being fossil fuel dependent to being leaders in clean energy technology. But when you make plans for the future, it's important that you have plans of substance. And at the heart of our plan, our 2050 plan to reach a 2050 target, is actually actionable items of commercialisable, scalable opportunities for Australia. Now, when I first became elected, I went to see the Prime Minister and the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction, and I said it should no longer be a matter of if we have action, it should be a matter of how. So we no longer have if and when, but a matter of how we get there. And that's when we get down to our low emissions technology strategy and our investment roadmap. And you can see that with $20 billion of investment, by partnering with and unleashing the capabilities of the free market and bringing online $80 billion of investment, we will have $100 billion invested in making sure that the energy of the future will be scalable and commercialisable. For instance, we have in our 5 stretch targets, which have now become 6 stretch targets, getting hydrogen to under $2 a kilogram. I recently drove a hydrogen car. I didn't think that was going to be possible in just such a short period of time. You can go down, you actually can fuel a new demonstration hydrogen car. You can take sunshine, you can make it into hydrogen by using electrolyzers to crack to take energy and then to crack water and make hydrogen. Freeze, compress it, freeze it, and then put it into cars and drive electric vehicles. But 1 kilogram can only get you 100 kilometres. And the issue with that 1 kilogram is at the moment it's too expensive to be commercialisable and available for everyone who might want to drive a hydrogen car. So we have to have solutions for Australia that are peculiar to the fact that we are an energy-intensive, energy-rich country with a wide brown plan, and we need to have solutions where consumers can get involved and make the right choices for them. So, for instance, with electric vehicles, we're investing in making sure that there are sufficient charging stations in hard-to-reach places. We're also investing hundreds of millions of dollars, in fact, $1.2 billion in a hydrogen and future fuel strategy. We also believe that green cement, green aluminium and green steel are going to be important for the future. And that's why investment in ARENA and the CFC, which is the world's largest government-owned green bank, are the ways to partner with industry to make sure that technology can lead us to the future. When we looked at COVID, we looked to the opportunities, but we didn't know what the answers were. That's why we need to invest in diversified technologies to solve the problems that we now face. And I have to say, Australia has a very big opportunity to capture carbon soil. So that's one of our other stretch targets. We have green energy, hydrogen under $2 a kilogram, carbon soil, carbon capture and storage. We also have battery storage that needs to be improved because we don't have batteries that are able to get us through the night or through a wind drought, as we've seen in the UK. We need to improve our battery capability. But we also need to look at new technologies as they come on board, and that includes things like carbon storage in the soil, as well as live feedstock fuel feed, because there are difficult to abate parts of our economy, and that includes ensuring that methane from our cows can actually be altered in some way through probiotics and livestock feed.
Thanks very much, Katie. That's 4 minutes.
Thanks, Catherine.
All right, thank you to all of our political candidates for your opening remarks. It's wonderful to hear the robust discussion that we have in Higgins on climate change and health, and the different views that are being put forward. Now we're going to move to our Q&A section. So we're going to leave about half an hour for this. I invite everyone to post your questions. If you post them in the Q&A box as opposed to the chat box, they will be a little bit easier for us to see tonight. For the Q&A section, feel free to post in that box. We do ask again that things are kept respectful, but of course we're completely welcome robust discussion. Now for this section, each of our political candidates will have 2 minutes to respond to every question. We'll keep it nice and tight so that we can get through a number. And Roderick, if you'd like to chime in at any point, not in the middle of someone speaking, but if you'd also like to respond to a question, feel free. Just raise your hand, and we'd love to hear from you as well. All right, so this is going to keep me on my toes. I'm going to have to watch the chat box and time everyone for 2 minutes. So we'll do my best, but I am human, so it's sincerest apologies. We'll try and keep things fair and even. All right, now we've had a few questions pop up. In particular, so far, a couple have been about the role of fossil fuel subsidies, and in particular, if it's still appropriate for political parties to be accepting fossil fuel subsidies, given where we are and the necessity for urgent action on climate change. So we're going to rotate the order as we go through the questions. So for talking about responding to a question on fossil fuel subsidies, I'm going to hear first from Sonia, then from Katie, and then from Michelle. All right, Sonia, so if we can hand over to you for a 2-minute response to a question on the appropriateness of fossil fuel subsidies, given where we are in addressing climate change as an urgent public health issue. Thank you.
Well, as you might imagine, no, I don't think that we should have fossil fuel subsidies, and no, I don't think that we should have donations, political donations from fossil fuel companies. I think, as I've said quite clearly, fossil fuel is the cause of climate change, the biggest cause of climate change, and you can't have fossil fuel therefore playing a part in the solution. You know, we had a delegation at COP26, which was branded in fossil fuel branding in what is arguably Australia's humanity's rather last chance. And our government went looking for loopholes to avoid getting out of coal, oil and gas. And we're widely regarded as the villain of that summit because of that, because we were trying to weaken the position on ending coal and fossil fuel. I don't really understand how that's morally defensible. When we're talking about the end of human survival, I feel honestly shocked that this is where we're at. So the Greens imbalance of power will reform political donations to make sure that fossil fuel companies and any vested interests can no longer hold our MPs hostage. I think that's the only way we're going to get our country back on the right path.
Thanks so much, Sonia. All right, next we'll hear from Katie Allen. Katie, over to you.
Thank you. Look, I believe that the mining industry in Australia has made a big commitment. Many of the big miners made a commitment to get to 2050 net zero themselves, and they actually have to be part of the solution. And if you look at many of these companies, they are actually transitioning and looking at demonstration hydrogen projects. For instance, Woodside has invested in a hydrogen project in the ACT and had a look at their hydrogen fueling station there. They know the customer is going to change. They know that Australia is no longer going to be able to sell fossil fuel to the world, and they need to get off fossil fuel themselves. So if you look at things like electric vehicles, for instance, there is 9 kilograms of lithium in an electric vehicle and 40 kilograms of nickel. So those are the critical minerals that are going to, drive the future. And we need to make sure that we move to using those sorts of critical minerals in our mining sector, and we need to move off fossil fuels. But I will say that if you want to have a look at the world in data and look at the graphs for each of the different countries, Australia has one of the highest dependence on coal in our electricity sector. And I think there is actually very big hopes that now we're starting to drive down and off coal very quickly. And because they have so much renewables coming online, and that's because Australians have been fantastic at taking up solar. We've got one of the highest uptakes of solar per capita in the world, but also that if we can transition through gas to get off coal as quickly as possible, as has happened in South Australia. So if you look at emissions by state, you can see Tasmania is almost completely dependent on hydro, just like New Zealand and Canada. South Australia is about 50% dependent on gas, so it's got the lowest contribution of coal, but the other states are really behind with regards to dependence on coal. So our electricity sector is about 66% dependent on coal, and that's way too high. We need to transition as quickly as we can off that. And in order to use and bring solar and wind more quickly into the grid, we need to have a stable firming power, which in the short term is going to be gas, but hopefully in the very near term will be hydrogen and better batteries as well as hydropower.
Thanks. Unfortunately, that's 2 minutes. All right, Michelle, we'll hand over to you for your answer to the question on fossil fuel subsidies.
Yeah, let me answer it this way. I think we need to just zoom out a little bit here. I mean, there is a structural intimacy between fossil fuels and energy that is cheap and dirty and capitalism, okay? So wealthy countries have become wealthy off the back of fossil fuels. That is a fact, all right? It basically fueled the Industrial Revolution, and it was inaugurated in the steel, in the cotton and the wool mills of England, all right? So this is a problem for all OECD developed countries. They have all prospered off the back of fossil fuels. And now it is happening in emerging economies, large economies like Brazil and China and India, okay? The thing is that Australia is actually a fossil fuel giant. Australia is the largest exporter of coal in the OECD, and we are the third largest exporter of fossil fuels in the world after Russia and Saudi Arabia. We are a fossil fuel giant. We are actually, a petrostate, even though we don't identify that way. We've always considered ourselves, we've become wealthy off the back of agriculture, but that's actually not the case. Our number one export is iron ore, followed by coal, followed by natural gas. So, these minerals and fuels have kept the lights on in Australia. And this is why it is so hard to have a rational debate about decarbonizing in this country, because it means actually decoupling ourselves from what has made us wealthy. But what is not being taken into account by the current government is the cost of inaction. And this is something that Labor is acutely aware of, and it is something that we are going to be now costing and modeling by Treasury. And this was announced yesterday by Jim Chalmers. So, we are aware of the pros and cons of this. And I think that, we are committed to making Australia a renewable energy superpower. 3 ways to do that. 1, deploy what we have, and that's basically renewables and storage. Number 2, take a whole of society effort, which are all the pictures behind me. And number 3, bake in resilience and integrity in everything we do.
Thanks so much, Michelle. All right. So for our next question, we have a question about electric vehicles in the chat. So from John, Middle Australia wants to buy electric vehicles, but is being held back by a lack of policy. We need to tailpipe emission standards in line with Europe to encourage the import of EVs by manufacturers and government subsidies for buyers. Will your parties commit to these policies, or perhaps more broadly, we'll ask you to discuss what your party's policies are on EVs. So for this question, again, it'll be 2 minutes each, and the order this time will be Katie, Michelle, and then Sonia. So I'll hand over to you first, Katie. Thank you so much.
Thanks. That's a really excellent question. As a big proponent of EVs myself, I think the cost of EVs, in my view, is the thing that is actually the most important for uptake of EVs. Australia's got less than 1% of the community have EVs at this point in time. And we'll say Higgins is in the top 4. So that's a really good outcome. People in Higgins are taking up EVs. And that's partly because, we are a higher than average wealthy electorate and we have that capability. But we need to make sure that unlike in the UK, where there's more than 150 models of all different costs available. We don't have those coming to Australia. So we need the importers, because of course cars and EVs are not made in Australia, to provide the full fleet. And your question is quite right. That is going to be predicated on making sure there's a fleet emission standard. We need to be at a Euro 6 emission standard. We're not yet there, though the Minister, Angus Taylor, in a recent a press conference mentioned that there is work going on, including there's been a recent fuel security strategy to decrease the sulphite content in our fuels, which gives us a pathway to moving towards Euro 6, which of course as doctors we'd all be very happy about because it's less diesel particulate.
Thank you so much, Katie. All right, Michelle, we'll now hear from you on responding to a question on policies to encourage the uptake of EVs.
Yeah, look, I completely agree. The biggest barrier to uptake in EVs is the cost. Okay, so there are no cars under 40,000 in Australia that are EVs. So we have about 14 cars on the market here. In the UK, it's 134. And cost is the major issue. The problem is that the Morrison government's policy, their recent announcement of sprinkling, fast chargers around this country, is not actually going to bring down the cost of EVs. The free market has actually been operating, and what is staring us in the face is free market failure. Okay, so what Labor is actually trying to do here is incentivize the sale of EVs by basically removing inefficient taxes like the import tariff, which will, and fringe benefits tax, and that will basically scrape $2,000 to $9,000 off the cost of an EV, bearing in mind that 50% of the cars that are sold in Australia are actually for fleet. So, this will incentivize employers to actually buy EVs for their employees. Millions of cars. Now, we know that that's not enough. With respect to fuel subsidies, the EU has had, fuel standards, now for 10 years. Australia is a laggard in this respect. And, the Morrison government, actually the coalition government, instituted a ministerial forum on vehicle emissions. It was established in 2015 to coordinate a whole of government approach. Nothing has come from that. The Euro standard is going to be defunct because the EU is actually moving to Euro 7 in 2025. So Australia, has worse fuel than China. Our fuel has 15 times more sulfur than the fuel in China. And as a result, we are a dumping ground for old tech because companies in Europe will not send their cars here because our fuel is so substandard. Now, this could have been fixed years and years ago, and it hasn't. And what it means is that we're polluting our environment with particulates and also with aromatic carcinogens like benzene. So, I'm horrified when people are idling their car outside schools. Basically, children are being exposed to this.
Thanks, Michelle. That's about 2 minutes. All right, we'll now hear from Sonia on EVs. Thank you.
I certainly agree that we need to hurry along EV uptake. My son is very much on board that campaign. We sold our car quite recently and have been saving, and I'm trying to decide whether I can afford an EV, like many Australians, I bet, and many residents of Higgins, indeed. So what we need to do, of course, is incentivise EV purchase, make it easier, make it more affordable, and to introduce vehicle emission standards so that there are penalties for heavy emitting cars, and that'll bring the price of EVs down. Dr. Michelle's right, it does make us a dumping ground for older dirty vehicles if we don't have those emission standards. And then, of course, that just extends the years that we'll have diesel particulate in our children's lungs, which of course we don't need or want. So yeah, the Greens are pro-EV, of course.
All right, thanks so much, Sonia. So we've also had a question about 2030 targets coming in from the Malvern Group. So zero emissions by 2050 is all well and good, but it's widely regarded as a bare minimum commitment. What are you willing to, or your parties, to commit to by 2030? All right, so again, we'll stick to our 2 minutes, and the order for this question will be Michelle, Sonia, and then Katie. So Michelle, if we can hand over to you for 2 minutes on 2030 targets.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Look, everyone is holding their breath, waiting for the announcement of Labor's 2030 target. I actually don't know what it's going to be. I don't know where this is going to land. We've just come off COP, and Chris Bowen is running the modelling. He is looking at the costing and, factoring all the additional information that came out of COP. So, you know, we will announce it. It is not months away. It is a matter of weeks away, and it will be fully costed. It will be modeled, and it will be delivered to the Australian people. As you know, in 2019, we took a 45% reduction. I'm well aware that our peers around the world are sitting on much higher emission targets than the Morrison government has promised. You know, a 26 to 28% target is just paltry. And actually what the Morrison government is proposing is not even a target. It is a projection of 30 to 35%, which will be basically delivered by the states, okay? By the states who have all committed to net zero by 2050 without a single policy lever being pulled at federal level. As usual, the Morrison government is riding on the coattails of the states and taking all the credit when they deserve none of it. So Labor will announce its 2030 target. It will be more ambitious than what has been put forward by the Morrison-Joyce government, and we just need to wait and see. So just hold on, everyone.
All right. Thanks so much, Michelle. All right, Sonia, we'll hand over to you for your comment on 2030 targets. Thanks very much.
Well, as I've said, the Greens emissions reduction target is 75% by 2030, and we've selected that amount because that's what's consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees as determined by the Independent Climate Targets Panel. That's not a political opinion, that is the science. So since, you know, Labor had their 45%, the problem has gotten worse, not better. Our targets need to get higher, not lower. But in the end, I mean, it all comes back to the fact that both Liberal and Labor back more coal and gas. And so we need to see from them, they need to go into the next election with 75% emissions targets and a plan to get out of coal and gas.
All right, thanks so much, Sonia. And over to you, Katie.
Thank you so much. So our government's made a commitment with the Paris Agreement to our 2030 target, which we have projection that we're going to not just meet, but beat, which is just evidence that we are a government that delivers our commitment and that we provide certainty for that. Our next nationally determined contribution is 2035, which will be due in 2024. So I would like to bring that forward, and I'm interested in looking at the modelling, particularly because COVID hasn't had an impact on our emissions, and it will be important to take that into account as we come out of an emissions-constrained environment with COVID. We're going to have a rebound, and I think it'd be very important to look at the next phase of modelling. It's important to be aware that Australia actually not only is committed to meeting its targets and actually delivering on them. If you go and look at the Climate Change Performance Index, and I encourage people online to go and have a look at the report, have a look at all the different graphs for each of the different countries that are on a pathway that is a Paris-compliant pathway. Australia is, UK is, Canada, US and New Zealand are not. So they talk a big game, but they're not delivering like we are. And if you look at those countries that are exporters of large resources like Russia and India and China, they're nowhere near, they're going in the opposite direction. So our Australian government has delivered and it will continue to deliver. The thing I'd also like to say is that we need to hold people to account to their emissions. And we are one of the very few countries in the world that actually measures every greenhouse gas from every sector, including methane, every quarter. Now, there'll be another update for that national emissions quarterly report in December, and there'll be one every quarter going forward. That accounting has been well received in COP26. It's a bit of a small headline event, but that is going to be taken into the International Carbon Markets Article 6, and it's going to be very important to improve our standardised transparency framework for the globe, because emissions don't know boundaries, and it is important that everyone is held to account and uses the proper carbon accounting mechanisms.
Thanks so much, Katie. All right, our next question is from Yingo on sustainable healthcare. So 50 countries at COP26 have committed to develop climate resilient and low carbon healthcare systems, not including Australia. Can the candidates comment on whether they would introduce a national plan for climate change and health to ensure that our health workforce and services are able to manage these increased demands and operate sustainably? And I must say, as someone who's spent some time working as a remote GP, 600 k's from the nearest town, the answer to these questions are quite close to my heart. So the order that we'll have for this question, if I'm still on track, I think will be Sonia, Katie, and then Michelle. All right, so Sonia, if we can hear from you on your comment on sustainable and resilient healthcare systems.
So the Greens launched their health policy recently, and part of that suite was to bring mental health care into Medicare and dental. And certainly I think that goes a long way to resolving one of the key issues of health components of the climate crisis, which we know that mental health is adversely affected. But of course, I do personally think that provision of healthcare with a specific focus on the escalating climate emergency is really important. I can't speak to direct policy on that. We haven't released our full policy suite yet before the election. But yeah, that's a really good point. And I personally think, yes, that sounds important to me.
Right. Thank you so much, Sonia. And Katie will now hear from you.
So I'm not sure I quite heard the question. Could you tell it again? So I'm running out of batteries because I've been traveling. So my apologies for the noise in the background.
No worries. I'll read out the whole thing again. That's no trouble. So it's basically that 50 countries at COP26 committed to develop climate resilient and low carbon healthcare systems, not including Australia. Can the candidates comment on whether they would introduce a national plan for climate change and health to ensure that our health workforce and services are able to manage the increased demands and operate sustainably?
Yeah, thank you. That's a fantastic question. I've been on the science committee, the bipartisan science committee, and I actually called for a recycling and waste inquiry. I'm very proud of having called for that inquiry, and we have a report called Rubbish to Resources, Enabling the Circular Economy. And we heard from hospitals around Australia about the massive amounts of medical waste that is produced. And in fact, if you have a look at one of the recommendations from the report, which is recommendation 21, committee recommends the Commonwealth Government undertake improving further research into improving waste management and resource recovery in the medical sector, including opportunities to reduce, recycle and reuse waste from hospitals, clinical practices and medical facilities. This is interesting. Consideration should be given to establishing a unit similar to the NHS England's Sustainable Development Unit to harmonise Commonwealth and state and territory regulation, and the committee recommends the Department of Health take the lead on this body of work in consultation with the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment. So that report has not been responded to yet by the Minister, but I'm hoping to have that report responded to in the next few weeks to months. And that would hopefully look to that recommendation. So I'm a big supporter of that, and I'm very proud of the contribution I've made for that report.
Right, thanks so much, Katie. And Michelle, if we can hear your thoughts on sustainable and resilient healthcare systems. Thank you.
Look, I work in a hospital day in, day out, and I am absolutely conscious of the volume of waste that we generate from even, very trivial procedures like putting a drip into someone. It's just absolutely criminal. So it is a great question. What I would say is I'd answer it this way. There are two approaches we're taking. One, when you legislate a binding 2050 net zero target, what it means is that you embed in every product life cycle emissions reduction, okay? So it sends a signal to the manufacturers that we are driving to net zero, and the expectation from government, because it would be auditable, it will be, there is an accountability trail here, is that everything we start doing tilts this nation towards net zero, including all the products that we use in our day-to-day lives. The second approach that we are taking is more on a manufacturing level. So we're committing 15 billion of public money, which will be partnered with another 15 billion of private money to basically create what is called a national reconstruction fund. Manufacturing in this country has been in decline, and we are basically here to usher in a renaissance in not only renewable technologies, turbines, batteries, EVs, high-speed rail. There's no reason we can't make these things here. And this is certainly on Anthony's policy radar, but also we're looking specifically at innovative ways to manufacture packaging to reduce waste and really drive us towards this so-called, circular economy, which is what we really need to do. But these two things, putting a focus on manufacturing, local manufacturing, will build resilience into our economy. It will also drive down the waste that you're talking about, and also legislating a net zero 2050 target is a binding thing. It is not just an empty promise. This is binding, and it tilts our entire country towards this single point of light.
Thanks so much, Michelle. All right, we've had a few questions in the chat earlier on about biodiversity. So I'll amalgamate a few together, but we know biodiversity is that we've experiencing an extinction crisis, and a large number of species are becoming extinct. And there are health implications from that. In particular, less biodiversity has been linked to increased risk of future pandemics. So we've had some questions about your party's policies on preserving biodiversity and protecting nature and our forests. All right. So I think for this question, and panel, correct me if I've lost track on my order, but I think we're hearing from Katie first, then Michelle, and then Sonia. All right, Katie, so if you can speak to us about preserving biodiversity and nature. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. Well, the first thing to say is at the sort of macro level, the Minister for the Environment, Susan Lee, is very passionate about biodiversity, including flora and fauna, and she has a threatened species register, and there's been a significant amount of investment in making sure that some of our threatened species in particular are being supported, and hopefully we can start to reverse some of the problems that we have had as a nation. During the bushfires, for instance, there was a significant loss of life. And we lost millions of koalas, for instance, and there was a lot of funding put to local zoos and outreach centres to help our poor, threatened wildlife during that period. And the stories that happened during the bushfires are really, awful. I think we've all seen the terrible, stories of koalas being, having to walk across the hot coals to get to water because they can actually survive in the trees, but they actually had to get out. I went down to the Melbourne Zoo with the Minister for the Environment to have a look at some of the procedures that were taking place to try and help those poor wildlife through the bushfires. But more than that, it does come down to local issues. And so in Higgins, but in fact, across 151 electorates across Australia, every single electorate gets a local environment grant program. And I'm very proud of the contribution I have made to investing $200,000 into local environmental projects, which includes things like revegetation across Higgins, looking at things like along our waterways and improving things like litter waste traps and native plantings and market gardens and things like this are all very important for our local native environment. And of course, Higgins is a very built up area, so we need to be very careful about Gardeners Creek and the Yarra River, and I've worked with local councils about this issue. And of course, we have our National Clean Up Australia Day, which is also very important to make sure we get as much rubbish out of it. And I'd like to say out of the rivers and waterways. One last thing is that Trevor Evans, the Minister for Waste Reduction, is phasing out whole lots of different plastics, including polystyrene. And there's been a lot of work at state level on single-use plastics, which is also helpful.
Thanks very much, Katie. All right, if we can now hear from Michelle on your thoughts on biodiversity and preserving nature. Thanks very much.
Great question. So look, I'll answer it in two ways. One, at a very local level, we have committed to rewilding the areas around our urban rivers, and this was a recent policy announcement. In fact, I recently put in on behalf of a community group in Higgins a proposal to rewild Stonington, and it's been approved. So if an Albanese-led government is in fact elected, then this local community group will receive these funds. So that is at a local level. But I want to zoom out. Let's be frank. There is no amount of money that is going to fix this mass extinction crisis that we are living through right now, okay? No amount of money. The only thing that is important is to drive the entire world to decarbonize as quickly as possible. So that means that we need to do that. We are legislating the net zero 2050 target in order to tilt this nation to that single goal. And you will hear in due course in the next few weeks what our 2030 target is, and we have a plan, all right, to deliver that. And it is a holistic plan. It is an all of society effort. It is not just the province of one single portfolio. It requires the entire, multiple policy levers to really drive us to that single goal. The second thing I would say is that we need, as a rich country, to show leadership. We are currently a handbrake on emerging economies, large emitters decarbonizing. So they look at us, they point the finger at us, and they say, why should we decarbonize if you haven't decarbonized, right? And this is exactly what happened in Glasgow. India, Brazil, China looked at Australia, and basically they as a bloc, they decided to water down the proposal to, instead of phasing out coal, phase down coal, okay? And this is what we did. We blocked the decarbonisation efforts of some large emitters. So, we need to just get real here, people. The most important thing here is to decarbonise. The most important thing is to get rid of this government who have no credible climate policies, who are full of spin and marketing, and basically will now wage a fear campaign on the Australian population. It will only be a clutch of seats like Higgins.
Thanks very much, Michelle. That's 2 minutes, unfortunately.
Thank you.
All right, and Sonia, we'll hand over to you.
Well, this one's really dear to my heart. You know, ENGOs are among my most treasured clients. And of course, the truth is that Australia is a global pariah on biodiversity protection. We have the highest extinction rates in the world. And in fact, the government hasn't resourced the recovery of our threatened species or protected our habitat. It's done the opposite. It's weakened environmental legislation. So the Greens will, they're the Greens. They'll establish a comprehensive statewide biodiversity framework with a funding mechanism. They'll review all environmental legislation and evaluate where we are missing what we need to do and where improvement is needed. And as a matter of urgency.
Brilliant, thanks so much, Sonia. So we'll do 2 more rounds, 2 more questions for our panelists, and then we'll wrap up for tonight. We have, thank you to everyone who's posting questions in the chat. And I also thought I'd mention that we actually have over 100 people online tonight. So that's absolutely fantastic to see this level of engagement. So thank you, everyone. All right, so for our second last question, we've had quite a number of questions in the chat addressing Australia's role as a global citizen, and in particular, our responsibility to developing countries. And there's been a couple of people that have particularly highlighted the situation for Pacific Island nations, given that developing countries, we know, has historically contributed less to climate change, but disproportionately experience its health and other impacts. So for this question, if we can ask all of our panelists to comment on Australia's role as a global citizen, in particular with our regard to developing countries and in our region. And for this question, we'll go Michelle, Sonia, and then Katie. So Michelle, if I can hear your response in 2 minutes, thanks so much.
Great question. I have a picture up here on my thing of the Foreign Minister of Tuvalu standing in knee-deep water addressing the COP summit. Okay, everyone saw that. It's iconic. This is not a theoretical risk to these people, okay, to people around the world in developing countries. It is an acute and existential threat to their lives right now. They are essentially facing oblivion. We have 10 million people living in tiny coral atolls dotted all throughout the Pacific, and they are looking to a rich country like Australia, with whom they have actually got ties with, right, for leadership on this. And we are facing, you know, through our own intransigence of this government, we are basically facing a future of 10 million climate refugees. This is real. It's already happening throughout the world. There's been internal displacement and a movement of 10 million people just this year due to climate events. So, you know, Australia must show leadership. It will never happen under the Morrison-Joyce government. It will just never happen. They are wedded to fossil fuels. You know, they talk the talk in green seats like in progressive seats like Higgins, but the reality is that they are continuing to expand the fossil fuel industry. It's even written down in their plan that they will be selling coal for decades to come. So, you know, there will never be decarbonisation under the Morrison-Joyce government, never. Only a Labor government will have a suite of policies that will shepherd this country through, and in doing so will also reinstate its obligation as a leader for poorer countries and fulfill those obligations. So, you know, we're not shying away from that. We understand the science, and we understand that it is so important to be a global citizen and to, you know, that this is not a triviality. It is an acute existential threat for millions and millions of people around the world. So, you know, there is a lot at stake, and we understand that.
Thank you so much, Michelle. All right, Sonia, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a powerful photo. I kept it too. It was very moving. So the outtake of COP26 is that 1.5 degrees is only being tenuously held on to with a hope and a prayer, almost out of reach. Even if every country fulfills its COP26 commitments, we're still headed for 2.4 degrees of warming, which is catastrophic and which makes every effort crucial. Every fraction of a degree counts for the kind of future that our Pacific neighbours have. To me, it's kind of extraordinary to think that in 1 decade, Australia has gone from being a trailblazer on climate, to being dead last on a list of 60 nations. So yeah, once again, our government has let us down on a global stage. They've let down our Pacific neighbours, who'll be the first to bear the brunt. They've let down our own communities who are already experiencing the impacts, bushfires, droughts, floods, heat. And most of all, they've let down our children. We're handing them a mess, a diseased earth, and we must cure the disease. We know what to do. The one thing we must do that thing this electoral cycle. The government we have on the other side of this election needs to be a government that priorities real climate action, getting out of coal, oil, and gas. That's it. That's what we have to do.
Thank you so much, Sonia. And now, Katie, will hear your thoughts on our question in relation to our responsibilities to developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Look, absolutely, we have responsibility to developing countries. If you look at what, nationally, internationally, richer countries have got wealthy on cheap energy. I mean, it has been the underlying reason why some countries have kind of steamed ahead, literally. So we have a moral responsibility to those countries that haven't been able to develop at the rate that we have. But we also have a moral responsibility to help them to do it in a way that is achievable through renewable energy. And there are lots of, again, demonstration projects about how to make energy low cost and available, how to make sure that they can use solar, they can use hydrogen, they can use the products that we can help support them to deliver. I mean, obviously we have our global commitments to the globe with regards to getting our own emissions down, but things like making sure that we look after and we don't ship our waste to their countries, because after all, it's our waste, it's our responsibility. We have a responsibility to look after our waste, which is a certain percentage. I think it's about 16% of the emissions pie. I went up to Papua New Guinea a couple of years ago, and there's absolutely no doubt that the Coral Sea cable that is being sent up by Australia, built up into Australia, will help to develop Papua New Guinea, because it'll allow it to have better access to the internet and better access to infrastructure. There's no doubt that some of the technologies that are coming online, whether it's the internet or whether it's clean technologies or whether it's even medtech technologies, will enable developing countries to become wealthier quicker and to be lifted out of poverty. And there's no doubt that climate change is going to have and is already having effect not only on natural disasters and increasing extreme weather patterns, but also the ability for the world to access clean air, clean water, clean food. And these are the essentials that everyone should have the rights to have. And so there's no doubt that climate change is something that is going to have to be embraced by all of us together, and our responsibility, not just to developing nations around the world, but to our friends in the Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific. And the Morrison government has invested significantly into the Pacific Step Up, knowing that that is where our leadership needs to be focused.
Thanks so much, Katie. All right, we'll have one last question for our panellists, and then we'll briefly hand over to Roderick McRae and then wrap up our evening. So the last question has come up a few times in the chat box tonight. And it's getting to the fact that we have spoken quite a bit about targets tonight. But despite the various targets of governments across Australia, state and federal, there's still, we've heard in the Q&A box, more than 100 coal and gas projects that are in the pipeline to be developed in Australia. So the question is about how can we have emissions reductions targets when across Australia, we're still planning to develop large-scale fossil fuel projects. And for our last question, we'll have the order of Sonia, Katie, and then Michelle. All right, over to you, Sonia. Thanks so much. And just a reminder to our panelists, this will be our last 2 minutes before we hear from Rod and then wrap up. Thank you so much.
Short answer, you can't. If you take coal out of the ground that's been safely stored there for like 300,000 millennia, you cannot keep it out of the atmosphere. There is no method, no technology that will keep it out of the atmosphere that we have in our possession right now. Carbon capture is an expensive failure that violates the laws of thermodynamics. We don't have a magical unicorn. You have to keep fossil fuels in the ground. It's the only solution.
All right, short and sweet. Thank you, Sonia, for those strong final words. All right, next we'll hand over to you, Katie. Thank you.
So I believe that we need to transition off the dirtier end through as quickly as we can as possible, and that carbon abatement is an important part of ensuring that there are going to continue to be difficult to abate sectors. So, for instance, for us to get onto our bikes and onto public transport and active transport, which we all need to do, walk to work, catch public transport, if you can afford an EV, that's great, but we still do need steel. And until we get to the point where we can produce green steel at a cost that is actually commercialisable, we will still need these sorts of things, unless we want to go back to kind of living in a hut. So they're going to be difficult to abate sectors. So things like carbon soil and carbon capture and storage, which as it is true that it's still a long way to go with technology. We need to look at all of these technologies and we need to move fast in order to get to the point where we can actually abate, because at the end of the day, we know we will continue to produce some carbon. It's just not impossible not to. So we need to make sure that we can abate that so we can get to net zero. It's about not zero, it's net zero.
Thank you so much, Katie. All right, and for the final question, we'll hand over to you, Michelle. Thank you.
Catherine, you might need to repeat the question for me, because I think I've heard it a little bit differently to everyone else. Could you just...
Yeah, sorry. So the question was about the, to paraphrase, the consistency of having our governments across Australia supporting ongoing coal and gas development projects, despite having emission reduction targets.
Okay, great question. A Labor government will not support public money going towards projects, coal, gas, petroleum projects that will not be supported by the market, okay? Let me make that clear. A Labor government will not put public money towards projects that will not be, that pose an excessive risk to the market. So that's how I'm going to answer that. I think we need to just, take a step back from this. On the one hand, we have the Morrison-Joyce government who, do not walk the talk, right? Fossil fuels are expanding. Even their own plan talks about the gas industry expanding to 15% by 2050, all right? And the coal market halving to by 2050. That's not zero market. That is still a pretty viable market that they are proposing. Then on the other extreme, we have the Greens, who basically want to prematurely shut down all projects right now, flick a switch. And what that's going to do is basically expose this country to massive energy volatility and energy crunch. And it's also going to leave people behind. It is going to aggravate communities, the same communities that have made us wealthy as a country. We have an obligation to support those people who have supported us, because unless we transition these communities out of coal jobs and into renewable energy jobs, this will be a handbrake on us raising our climate ambition forever. So, what Labor is proposing is Labor is actually the centrist voice here. We are the sensible centre, and we are the ones who are going to thread this needle, all right, with a suite of policies. And I would argue, given our roots in the workers' movement, we are best placed to really transition these people carefully, because people are fearful in these coal mining communities. It's a long way away from Higgins, but it is absolutely the reason we have not achieved the kind of progress we deserve. We have been gridlocked on this now for decades, and we can't afford to be gridlocked for another 10 years. My argument to you all is, you have an opportunity here to think about how you are going to vote in the next election. Understand that we need to remove this gridlock and actually progress.
That's the 2 minutes. Thank you so much. All right, so we'll now hear some brief closing remarks from Roderick McRae, and then we'll bring our night to an evening to an end.
Been a long night, Catherine.
It's very easy to do that, isn't it? Look, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'm sort of reminded that Mad Max was set in 2021. I'd certainly like to thank the panellists. It's never easy to undertake these sort of things. It's got to be worse staring into a camera in your PC or your electronic device. And I certainly hope we retain or capture all of the comments and the questions that have been very, very instructional. Just want to state that AMA Victoria definitely considers that climate change is a health emergency. And we've spoken tonight, there's the heat issues, bushfires, particles 2.5 micrometres below getting into the alveoli of the lungs. We've now got floods around Australia, rising sea levels, coastal erosion, and all of this links in with physical or then linking into mental health. So it is a mess, and it is something we must attend to. Now, a lot of the comfortable, wealthy, and I guess that's many people in Higgins, want to do the right thing. Many of us will have purchased diesel vehicles only to later learn we were dudded by smart CEOs very cunningly. We are buying EVs, whether they're hybrid at the moment and they're going to go full electric vehicles, despite the very currently, what I'll put in quotation marks, interesting hurdles that exist. Now, it is for everybody here, the other 108 people, it's likely one of the panellists will be, after the election, the Higgins representative. So I'd like to remind all panellists of the recommendation that AMA and DEA has made for the Australian government to establish a national sustainability unit for healthcare to reach net zero emissions by 2040. Nobody's going to complain if it comes on harder and faster. Overall, healthcare is underpinned by science and all of its principles, and we plan to be part of the solution. AMA Victoria supports all the admirable goals, and importantly, we're not party political. We will work with anybody to get us there. But thank you to all this evening. Great participation, and also you, Catherine. Very nice chairing.
Thanks very much, Roderick. All right, so thank you to everyone tonight. Thank you most of all to our panellists, our health experts, and our political candidates. We really appreciate you giving your time tonight and answering all our robust questions from our highly engaged citizens of Higgins who care very much about climate change and health. I'd like to thank all of our attendees. I think we almost hit 120 in the end, so that's quite extraordinary. Now, the last question that you all may have is what to do if you're interested in staying part of this conversation. So I'm going to very briefly share my screen. There we go. So if you are interested, you can, of course, join or support DEA. You can continue the conversation by contacting any of our political candidates. That's just their emails from their websites. And there is, of course, another campaign that's called Together We Can that's being coordinated by the Australian Conservation Foundation. So if you're not a doctor or I'll prefer not to get involved through DEA, although we hope that you will. We think we're a great organisation. That's another organisation that's trying to get as many people as possible involved in addressing climate change related issues. So thank you all again so much, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with you all. Cheers.